thrilled to welcome back my dear friend Tani Prell to Makom Solel Lakeside. Tani was with us over Martin Luther King weekend, which by now seems like such a long time ago, when she shared her Jewish journey with a group of about 50 of us, I think. And we wanted to bring her back for an encore, but not of the same program. So just a little bit of a background on Tani. She is a true partner of Makom Solel Lakeside. She's committed to fostering inclusive Jewish spaces. Tani is on the North American Board of Trustees for the URJ with Ross Erlebacher, Janet Buckstein, and me, where she also serves on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force of the URJ, also with me. As an alum of the URJ's Juvenation Jews of Color Leadership Fellowship, Tani worked to develop trainings for religious school leaders to build more inclusive Jewish classrooms and schools. She serves as a DEI facilitator for the Foundation for Jewish Camps and for RAC, Illinois. Tani received the start of her DEI training as a Teach for America Corps member, where her work focused on restorative justice through the arts. She is a recent graduate from the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning, where her capstone focused on how the history of Jews of color can better inform inclusion in Jewish spaces today. So needless to say, Tani, we are so thrilled that you're back. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Tani.
Yay, thank you, Wendy, for that wonderful introduction and welcome. And I'm so happy to be with Makom Solel Lakeside again. You all are just a wonderful group. So I was so excited when Wendy and Vanessa invited me back. So thank you for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll be sharing my screen for most of throughout this session, my talking part of the session, and then there's definitely going to be a long chance for us to be able to just ask any questions that have been on your mind. I'm here to be a resource, and while I might not have all the answers, I'm here to help as much as I can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And while Tani's sharing her screen, let's just review. The best way, I'm going to be moderating, the best way to, you can electronically raise your hand, and it's by the participants little thing at the bottom of your screen, or you can privately chat me or chat everyone, and then I'll try to ask the questions in some type of order and, you know, group them. And, you know, we're here for an hour, and we'll try to get as many questions as possible.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. So I definitely am so glad to be in the space with everyone today. So I'm hoping in our time together today that first off, there's just so, with recent events, there are so many terms that are being used. And so to really familiarize ourselves with anti-racism work, it's so important that we understand the terms that are being used when we're talking about race. So we're going to together take some time to really talk through what these terms mean. And if you have any questions additional questions about the terms, or if there's other terms that you've been hearing and words that you've been hearing that you just want to know a little bit more about, now will be a really great place and space to ask those questions. And then we're gonna talk through some action steps and what anti-racism can look like for yourself now and in the future. And we're also going to do a deep dive when we go into the terms to look at the ways that race functions in America today. And then on the bottom, I have some questions just for you to start thinking about while we go through the presentation today. So if you have any questions about current events, if you've been wondering anything about for additional historical context around race in America, if you've been wondering what you as an individual can be doing, or as Jews what we can be doing, and then again, if there are any just things that you would like to have clarified around race, be thinking of those questions as we go through. So when I think about anti-racism work, I really think about this quote by Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, and he said, "The old must be renewed and the new must be made holy." And it's so important that we understand that with the recent murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless, countless others, that they weren't just isolated incidents that occurred, that there, for every system that you can think of that functions in America, from education to healthcare to housing, they've been built in ways that actively oppress Black and Indigenous and people of color. And so it's not enough for us to try and fix these one-offs. We really have to be thinking about how we're going to rebuild all of these systems and structures and do so in ways that are racially equitable and understand that history, as uncomfortable as it is. It's uncomfortable, but important and necessary and urgent work. So as far as the terms go, our very first one is BIPOC. So BIPOC, as a phrase, as a term and word, has really, really come into play recently. We've definitely heard people of color, but BIPOC in particular. So when I say BIPOC, what I mean is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so the reason why Black and Indigenous people have a designator that is separate from people of color is because race functions in a very historic and very specific way for those communities. And then when you hear the phrase people of color, that is more of a blanket term, including Latinx, including Asian. And if there's ever a time where a specific group is being talked about, if we're speaking specifically about the Latinx community, then instead of saying people of color, then we would just say Latinx. And when referring to a whole group, to that whole group, we would use the term BIPOC. And that will come up quite a bit today. So our next term is systemic racism. It gets thrown out a lot as something that we identify that we need to be doing work on. But like, what exactly does systemic racism mean? It is the normalization and legitimization of a variety of areas. So we have history, culture, our institutions, the way that stereotypes have been developed and the biases that we hold that advantage white people while producing cumulative, ongoing negative outcomes for BIPOC. And so what we're going to spend quite a bit of time on after this, after a few slides, is to really look at, when we say systemic racism, what does that actually look like and how does that actually function in America? And then the word anti-racism. So anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing these systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And so later on, we'll take a look at what this can look like in your own life in terms of redistributing power, and then also taking a look at what does anti-racism mean in the context of systemic racism. Because as we'll see, all of these terms are interconnected. And so when I think about anti-racism work, this quote by Elie Wiesel is absolutely, I think, symbolic of anti-racism. And he said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take side. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim, and silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." And so in anti-racism work, we have to be taking active steps. We have to essentially be showing our work of anti-racism. It's not enough for us to say, I don't have racist thoughts, I don't do racist things, because we as Americans have very much been conditioned to see race and to see racism as these very violent acts. When we think racism, we think KKK, we think violent acts like lynching, but there's so much that is invisible and part of every system that's around us, that race is built into all of it and racism is built into all of it, that consciously or unconsciously we are contributing to in various ways. And so with anti-racism, we're actively figuring out what are we going to do to address all of the oppression that is being faced by BIPOC. And then two other key terms is privilege and oppression. So for privilege, it's a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And on the flip side of that, we have oppression, which is the systematic subjugation of one social group by a more powerful social group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more powerful social group. So for every group that is being oppressed, and we can think about these groups historically and today. So Jewish people as a group of oppressed people, LGBTQIA+, people with disabilities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are all examples of oppressed groups. And so for all of those groups, on the flip side, there is a group who is benefiting from that oppression. And so we, in our work, and in a lot of the readings that and resources that you'll be provided after this, it's really taking a look at where we fall into those oppressed groups, where we fall into those privileged groups, and how are we working to close that gap and create equity.
Before you go on, could you talk kind of a little bit more about privilege, white privilege? That it doesn't mean that you're a millionaire or a billionaire. It means you have white skin. And if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I think, and I could be wrong, that people on our studying with us this morning will say, well, I grew up poor, I wasn't privileged, but I'm pretty sure everybody but you grew up white.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. Absolutely. So, and it relates perfectly to our next quote by Peggy McIntosh. So Peggy McIntosh is an anti-racism expert who in the 80s really coined the term white privilege in 1988 when she wrote in Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege. And this quote really connects to it. And she explains that I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. And to what Vanessa is saying is that we can be part of various oppressed groups while still very much benefiting from white privilege. And so what I'll be sending out to you is Peggy McIntosh created a checklist of different ways that white privilege plays out in our day-to-day lives, in these invisible things that we might not have even thought about. And for some of that could be being able to go into a workplace and see the majority of people who look like you. When you think about who your bosses are, have they likely been white? When you turn on the TV, are you most likely to see characters and individuals who are also white? All of these ways that society and our systems have created these different areas that actively benefit white people. And in so many ways that white people have been meant to not even know that they were forms of privilege. And for all of those things, all of those areas of privilege, understanding that it's actively oppressing people who are not white. And we're going to go into some examples of that. So for this graphic, we have equality, equity, and liberation. And these are terms that we hear a lot. So equality assumes that we're all the same, that no one is walking around with more privilege or with greater oppression than anyone else. But in the statistics that we're going to see in a little bit, that is very much not true. So equality assumes that we're all the same and we're going to just give people the same thing in order to move forward. So the term equity understands that there are these systems in place that are actively oppressing people who are not white. So it helps, the concept of equity helps to put things in place, such as being super transparent about how how we pay our employees, making sure that there is that there is equity in college access. And yet the fence is still there, and the fence was built by people. And so in order for there to be real liberation, we have to get rid of the fence entirely. And so that the fence, if we're thinking about systemic racism, the fence are those systems that we need to break down. And so now we're going to go into a few of those systems and how they play out for Black people in particular. All right, so when we're thinking about systems, this first one is our criminal justice system. So there's a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics here, but what I would really like for us to, I don't know if you can see my point. Oh, I don't know if you can see my pointer. But this little pie, that despite America having 5% of the world's population, we have a quarter of all of the incarcerated people in the entire world. And when we think even more specifically within America, even though Black people make up just 13% of people in America, they are 40% of the people who are currently incarcerated. And this was a very purposeful and systematic process that has been going on since slaves were first freed in 1865. And once Black people were given freedom, the criminal justice system and our prison system in many ways replaced slavery, in that for the decades and years to follow, we would increase the number of Black people who would be put into prison as a way of still maintaining control over these groups. And we can think even more specifically about then the impact that has on families, the impact it has on being able to create generational wealth within the Black community when so many people are incarcerated. And I highly recommend everyone watch the film 13th if you haven't already, which really is going to dive even more deeply into this. And it's really going to show, when we talk about systems of racism, the policies that were put in place to continue this cycle. And then we have the term redlining, which people have become increasingly familiar with. And so this graphic isn't necessarily, it's not a graphic of redlining. It's actually, this shows Chicago, and it is actually a graphic of community areas that have the lowest childhood opportunity. And childhood opportunity is a term that is used to measure how many opportunities children have in a certain area, all the way from access to clean and healthy foods, access to adequate medical care, the infant mortality rate, educational opportunities, and so much more. It goes into the lead levels of children's blood. So I will send the link to this. And so the areas in red are the areas with the lowest child opportunity rates. And interestingly enough, these are also the areas that were impacted by redlining from the 1930s onward. And by redlining, what's meant by that is that those were predatory loan offerings, super high interest loans that were only in specific areas, so that Black people and brown people were only able to really be able to afford housing in these specific areas, and had to do so with incredibly high loan rates, which then causes this cycle of not being able to gain generational wealth, having your children not being able to pass down property or help your children be able to gain additional property. And it creates segregated neighborhoods that are still here today. And it's more than just housing. It's more than just these communities not having access to adequate housing. It has even greater implications as well. One of those being in terms of our healthcare system. So if you are a Black woman in this country, you are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than if you are white. And just like schools in Black and brown neighborhoods have far less funding, hospitals have far less funding as well, many times less qualified doctors, many times Black women in particular, but Black people and BIPOC in general tend to not be believed when when sharing systems and are misdiagnosed. Many have underlying health conditions because of redlining and because of living in environments that have poor air quality, have a lack of access to healthy foods. And we saw this play out with COVID as well, where Black people have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And this shows in Chicago that of the deaths, nearly 70% have been in the Black community. And then when we think about wealth as well, and this plays into everything that all of the previous graphics, that throughout history, and this is as of 2017, that the income, the household income of a Black family is 62% of what it is of a white family. And there is so much that plays into it, from biased hiring practices to coming to the school to prison pipeline, to so many families only having one parent who is able to contribute to an income because the other parent is incarcerated. And it is all, and when we think about all of these systems, we can't just target one. Like, we can't just put out a fire in one room of a house that's on fire. You have to knock down the whole thing. And that is really how we'll start to be able to make change. And because literally people's lives are depending on these systems being changed, and being changed quickly. And what is wonderful about the URJ is that it really has been at the forefront of so much of this work, of really identifying that, like, these are systems that, like, we need to be able to address. It understands the painful and uncomfortable history of race in America, and understands that as Jews, Jews living in America, we play a role in being able to create the ideal world, an ideal country that we would like to live in, and that includes addressing racial justice. And so the URJ has audacious hospitality, which is going into synagogues and into and camps and all areas of Jewish life, and making sure that as we're rethinking and re-envisioning, and especially with COVID, that we really have a chance to be able to dive into our current systems and practices, that we're thinking about racial equity when we're doing that. The URJ was the first religious group to sign on to studying reparations for the Black community, and understood that this was a priority. And the URJ is just absolutely at the forefront. And so right here, what we have is, if we think about racial justice as a tree, and we could think of URJ as the leaves. It's the action. Like, there are these actions that are taking place. And if it's a whole tree, at the roots, those are the individuals that comprise the movement as a whole. And there's no way that these leaves of action can be sustainable and really meaningful unless the roots are constantly being tended to. And so while we can absolutely be so excited about the wonderful things that the URJ is doing and that we as a movement are doing, we have to be doing that work internally as well, for there to be real, ongoing, meaningful change. And this graphic was created by April Baskin, who's the previous vice president for Audacious Hospitality for the URJ. So this is a URJ central graph. And so when we think about the ongoing work that we as individuals can be doing as we're supporting the movement and the work that the movement is doing, one of the biggest things is to be in a constant process of education. These systems that we've been talking about, they have been in play for 400 years since our country started, and they're not going away overnight. And we as individuals aren't going to unlearn and relearn new behaviors overnight. It has to be a constant process that we are embarking on. And so I'm going to share with Vanessa a list of resources for things that you can continue to read, listen to, watch, to be in this ongoing process. And also really exciting, we have the Makom Solel Lakeside has your book club where you're going to be reading White Fragility. So, and that is just like, it's such a wonderful, wonderful book to really start the process of thinking about this. And then we talked about how anti-racism is thinking about the redistribution of power. And for so long, the voices of BIPOC have been silenced, and there have been active ways of ensuring that BIPOC are not in positions of power, that they don't have a seat at the table. And so for that to change, something that you can do personally is to really start to think about and be honest with yourself about where are the positions that you do hold power, and who are the BIPOC who are also in the room with you, who you can redistribute that power with. And if you find yourself in rooms where there are no BIPOC, ask yourself why, and really consider speaking to those in leadership and those around you about what can happen to bring them into the conversation. In organizing, there's a phrase, no work about us without us. And so BIPOC need to be involved in conversations and decision-making. When George Floyd was unfortunately murdered, there was a lot of influx of donations right away of people wanting to just like jump in on the action, step up and make that happen. So if you were somebody who did donate, think about what those organizations were and see if you can set up a recurring donation. We are in a capitalist society, so money does play a very big role. And so ongoing donations help to ensure that the work can continue to happen. And then voting is huge. So please I encourage everyone to be just so thoughtful in the upcoming local and national elections about ensuring that our elected officials have a lens of racial equity in mind, and that they have a plan for what racial equity looks like. And then finally, it's the shortest one, but it can also be the most difficult one. Yes, Wendy. It can also be the most difficult one. You have to talk about race. And that's having those uncomfortable conversations with your family. And if someone says something that you know had racist undertones in the workplace, calling them out from a place of love, but needing those conversations to happen, because people depend on silence. And silence allows for racism and racial violence to continue and to perpetuate. And so we have to have those uncomfortable conversations with ourselves first and with others. And so you all are going to start the conversation in early August with Vanessa to read White Fragility. And so it's just, I hope it's such a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, we'll let you know how that goes.
Yes.
Before we go on, I want to thank our Tikkun Olam committee who have helped shepherd this and given ideas. And we said right at the beginning as we took a deep dive that this has always been an important conversation for us, but now even more so. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. That we will continue to have opportunities for us to study together, read together, and continue the process. And I have our first question. is from Rob Linder. Is there a country that has been particularly good at anti-racism work? And what can we learn from them?
Good question. So my area of most expertise is in terms of America and how race in America functions. And the reason why this is an important distinction, and while anti-racism work could have been successful in other countries, because race functions so specifically in America, in that all of the, specifically in regards to Black people, that from the founding of America, that Black people were all taken against their will into this country. And that from that point on, every area of life was created in order to hinder opportunities for Black people. And that the land of America was built, that America was built on the land of Native people here. And so I'm hesitant to share about countries that have done it really well. So like South Africa, like recognized that there were issues in place and has gone and has like started the conversation. No one has it right yet, but no one has it right yet.
All right, we're open for other questions. And while you're thinking of your questions, Tani, can you talk to us more about reparations? A little bit about what the URJ says, and full transparency, I've been doing a lot of reading, watching movies, and at first I thought reparations, how are we going to do that? Obviously, survivors of the Holocaust got reparations from Germany, lots of money. And so can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So reparations, it really recognizes how, because of the way that because of the impacts of slavery and then the ongoing impacts of slavery, from Jim Crow laws to from lack of access to voting, that there were so many systems in place that have put Black people in particularly generations behind in terms of having equal access. And so what reparations does, and what the URJ signed on to, is that we would study what it would mean for there to be a recognition of those wrongs. And reparations is essentially, how are we going to right these wrongs that have been in place? And so in some ways it's financial. It's also, how can we right these wrongs in the workplace with all of these various systems? And so they're definitely, right now it is in the study phase to really figure out what this would look like. But it's incredibly important and necessary. And Tanisa Coates has a wonderful article that really dives into why it's so necessary and gives examples of just generations of Black people who have not been able, regardless of, you can work 20 hours a day and still not be able to get ahead. And the need for reparations is a way to help fix that. And so I'll send that article as well, Vanessa, so people can have some like real life, real people examples of how impactful that would be.
Can you share with us what other congregations are doing anti-racism?
Yeah, so many congregations are having starting the conversations internally by hosting book clubs like you are. And I think that is so important, that when we're reading these things, that we're able to talk about it with a group of people, understanding that like we're all coming from different experiences and we're all at different points in this work, but understanding that like we're here now and that's what matters to go forward. What's also really exciting is that the URJ and Audacious Hospitality does have an assessment for congregations to take, and Wendy is very familiar with this. And so I know it's something that's being considered. And so some congregations have already completed the assessment. And what it is it helps congregations to go through your current practices and programming to see where you are at in terms of your anti-racist work. And coming from it as a place of non-judgment, but really just being honest with ourselves about where we're at and where we can grow. And then from that place, your congregations have been able to goal set. So whether it is making a goal that in the next few years that they would have 20% of their board seats filled with Jews of color and people of color, or if it is just starting from the beginning and revamping their website so that it's more, it shows a reflection of racial justice.
Wendy, did you want to say anything else on that quickly or not quickly or?
As soon as I unmute. Yeah, well, clearly it would be great for us to get a pulse on what's going on in the congregation. Tomorrow night there's a board meeting, and at the board meeting we're going to be discussing implicit bias training for the board per se and where we might go from there. So we realize as a congregation that we're at a moment, and we're creating programs such as the one today with Tani and the book club and others to address the moment right this second. And over time, we're exploring deeper dives, but we're not ready to give you any dates or specificity around that quite yet. But we know that people have passion around this, so stay tuned.
Yay. Tani, there's been a lot of, there's been a lot of action around tearing down statues. Many people, these Confederate statues especially, are not from 100 years ago. They're from 50 years ago in Jim Crow. However, there was a statue with Teddy Roosevelt, a Native American, and a Black man. And if you could tell us a little bit more about these and your feeling, and, is there a line that's too far? Is Mount Rushmore, I didn't know that the person who created Mount Rushmore was a KKK member. So, when you do deep dives into this, you find out a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So in regards to the statues, when you think of like what a statue is, it's a symbol. And for people who have had the privilege of having their history shown and reflected in history books, for some people, this can be a symbol of pride. But for so many people, these are symbols of the really, really uncomfortable and difficult and violent history of America. And it reminds many others, many Black, Indigenous, and people of color, of that this country was founded in a way that hated them. And as long as they stand as these symbols of hate, like we have to get rid of them. These people live in our history books. They're the history that we've been taught. And there's not a need for them to symbolically stand as a statue in our various spaces. And especially when there's not statues of others who did not have such a violent history in our country. And I think that there's a reason why we didn't know that the person who carved and designed Mount Rushmore was a KKK member. There's history that was hidden and actively kept from people to allow for these things to continue. And so in terms of a line for taking down statues, I personally feel the statues need to be taken down. And I think that our history books need to be very much re-examined for every oppressed group.
I agree with you. And of course, for those of us in the ed business, The state that buys the most textbooks is Texas. So the publishers print what Texas wants, and then we just get those books. And you know, they're not known for their liberal policies in any shape or form. And so I would love to take that on, some type of way of making our textbooks more equitable. I have another one here. Let's talk about the documentary, The 13th. What do you feel about the content? How can we fix the systematic government push to support this horrible racist activism? And we have two questions here. And the other one is, you know, the statistics about the huge percentage of our population, prison population, is Black, in stark contrast to the percentage of our national population. But, you know, the asker says, you know, are they there because they've committed crimes? And I don't know if you can kind of wrap, you can take as long as you want.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So first, for the in regards to the question of, well, perhaps those numbers are so high because they've committed crimes. What 13th will do a great job of really emphasizing is that those numbers have purposefully, that there have been policies legally put in place that will actively increase the number of Black people. So if you think about the 80s, how crack was purposefully brought into Black communities, and if we're taking this as an example, and that the prison sentences for having crack versus having cocaine were infinitely higher. And so a Black man who is holding just the smallest amount of crack for whatever reason will likely have spent his lifetime in prison, while those same numbers are not the same for white people. And if we think about how the police function in white communities versus in Black communities, and so I'm just going to give myself as an example. I grew up in the white suburbs, where my friend who went to my friends who are white would have parties all the time, have had so many interactions with the police, where if they were Black, they would all have been arrested by now, have stolen things, have had parties, been drunk in public, and all of these things that white privilege allows for there to be a passing of, but is so much more heavily there is such greater consequences for having Black skin and doing those same crimes. And so many people who are still in prison for weed possession, whereas there are so many white people who have also been found with the same thing and have had no legal consequences. And so those numbers are also so high because the prison sentences have been made to be so long that regardless of your crime, you are meant to live a good portion of your life in prison, and that the system has been set up in a way that finding adequate job opportunities once you have had any prison time becomes incredibly, incredibly difficult. And then, as we've unfortunately seen with the murder of Elijah McClain, that Trayvon Martin, that while Trayvon Martin was not with the police, but Elijah McClain, he did nothing but walk home. He was doing nothing and was murdered for being Black. And so it doesn't matter how kind you are or how educated you are, this system is made to be violent against you and to hinder opportunities. So in terms of what to do, while there's so much that we're doing the individual work, this is something that change needs to be able to be made on the legislative level. And we have to be voting for officials who recognize that private prisons are not okay. Right now, there is just a huge privatization of our prison system. and it's not meant to function as a business. And as long as it functions as a business, there will still be incentives to put more and more people there. And while we live in a country where Black and brown lives are the most expendable, those are the ones who will end up filling those prisons to continue to create revenue. But definitely vote. And then there's also,
we can't say that enough. And
yeah,
having more Sunday morning programs on getting out the vote, what to do, and that's crucial right now. Karen has a long, it's to everybody, and you can read it in the chat, but she said, how do you recommend choosing an area focus, a system to really work on changing?
yes. So on the big level, we have to know that like we have to be addressing all of them. For you personally, for us as individuals, because it is so much, and there's so much that's broken. It's really, and because we know that this needs to take time and it needs to be sustainable change, what I would recommend all of you to do is to really find your area that you feel most drawn to. So, and really doing a deep dive in terms of educating ourselves and finding the correct resources to be able to help. So if that for you is education, there are absolutely ways for us to be able to work with elected officials to ensure that the educational policies that are being put forth, and especially as we're thinking through COVID, and knowing and understanding that in white communities that have higher funding for education, in the event that schools do go back in fall or whenever that happens, knowing that right now many schools in Black and brown neighborhoods barely have enough funding to have toilet paper, barely have, I worked in CPS, barely have enough funding to make sure your kids have pencils, and teachers are the ones who very much bear that burden. And so when we think about that, if you are invested in education, making sure that those conversations are happening and that race is being taken into account when those decisions are being made. If you decide that you're super invested in addressing mass incarceration, there are a lot of resources for how you can help with the bail fund, because many people are sitting in jail right now simply because they cannot afford to pay their bail. So that could be a great ongoing donation that you could set up and that you could give. And then for all these areas, there's various ways to be able to be involved. And then also, and I'll send this out, but if you're also invested in mass incarceration, there's an entire list of companies right now that use prison labor as a way to maintain their businesses, and people get paid cents for the work that they do, and it's backbreaking labor. And so like that's a very quick boycott of those companies, and getting your friends to know about these things as well, and to talk about it, and changing the dialogue around our prison system and our legal system.
I so agree with you. Hubie, I know you have a question or a comment.
Actually, a couple of comments. We're going past it, but I want to go back on the tearing down of the statues. In other words, for example, after the end of World War II, there are no statues to Nazis, and nor should there be. At the end, there should be no statues, I agree, for those who participated in the U.S. Civil War. But after that, it gets a little more murky. For example, we have a problem about George Washington, and we know he had slaves. Okay, now the problem is, rather than being negative, how about some positive stuff? How about putting a statue up next to him of Edward Ayers, who was a Black hero in the Revolutionary War? How about talking about Custis Atkiss, who was the first Black to be killed in the Revolutionary War? How about statues? In other words, give something for the young Black boys and girls to look up to. Rather than tearing things down, how about showing them that they have a history and something that they should be proud of? I guess the other thing, forget it. I'll stop right there.
All right, Tani, what do you have to say?
So I would love for there to be statues like the ones that you suggested, and I would definitely support something like that. In the meantime, if getting rid of every statue means that we are able to get rid of the ones that are symbols of violence and of racism and of hate, then I say we still have to, if it needs to be a blanket thing that we get rid of, such as so it should be. And when we rebuild the statues, we should do it the way that you suggested.
What was it? There's
Mr. Frank.
Let's go back to the Civil War. Grant, U.S. Grant, who won the war for the North, no question, he had a single black slave. The question was, did he buy the slave or was it given to him as a gift? Then historically, we know that prior to the Civil War, he set the man free. So some of this gets a little murky to simply, absolutely, this is the way we're going to do it. I think we need a little flexibility and forethought here.
I love flexibility and forethought. Historically, what's happened when there has been a flexibility and forethought in regards to who's making those decisions, I would say if those decisions are being made, if we're going to really deep dive into all of these statues, the people who are deciding whether or not it stays needs to be BIPOC. So BIPOC need to be the ones who are making the decisions regarding which statues can continue to stay, because they weren't part of the conversations when they were made, at least involved in the conversation, because their voices were not represented when it started. So having multiple voices in the conversation to make those decisions, I think is key going forward. So then hopefully, as Mr. Frank, as you were saying, that we can have ideas of other statues that can be put up in its place.
Yeah, totally agree.
Or next to them.
I have another question. COVID has complicated so much of the support for needs of school children in the Black communities. There's no broadband in Chicago. What can we do to support? My daughter works in and lives in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. She's the only white person on her block. She feels very committed to her community. And she said, when we're virtual, my kids don't all have devices or they don't have Wi-Fi. So what can we do?
Yes. So that's one of the very difficult things when thinking about what the future of education might look like. Because in so many Black and brown communities, their lack of Wi-Fi, lack of devices, and like perhaps we can give everyone a device. It doesn't ensure that there's still the Wi-Fi accessibility, and certainly not in the same way that it's accessible in predominantly white neighborhoods. And so when we think about things that we can do, definitely making sure that if you're aware of any votes that are, going back to the vote thing, that for various school boards, if you can be calling your elected officials and making sure that they know and understand that when these decisions are being made, additional funding would need to be able to be put into these schools and into these communities. And so that's one way. And so much of it's going to depend on what it looks like. And so hopefully once we know, we can have a better sense of, okay, if on a governmental level, if those resources aren't being put there, what can we do to ensure that those resources are there and accessible?
Jack Altshuler reminds us that we're lucky to live in a blue state, but Wisconsin, that's a great place to volunteer your time. I know Rabbi's done it, and he'll be talking to us, Rabbi Ike. we'll be, as we get closer to the big election, we'll be talking to that. Diane, do you want to unmute and just talk about the RAC Illinois campaign, Every Voice, Every Vote, you know, some of the things that we're participating in because we're a URJ congregation?
Right, so we are currently very involved in RAC Illinois. Their big campaign is Every Voice, Every Vote. We're working on voter suppression. Watch your emails this week. We're getting a lot more information in a RAC meeting this week. Join Tikkun Olam, find out exactly what we're doing and how you can get involved with RAC Illinois. We're also working on all of the racial injustice projects. So we do have a lot going on right now. The book club is going to be a great start for us. We're very excited, but keep watching. There's going to be a lot of ways to get involved.
Julie Webb, if you want to say anything, and before she does, I will say that we have a Tikkun Olam Facebook page. We have a Tikkun Olam constant contact. So we're reaching out as best we can. And I know for me that just watching movies, Just Mercy is free, 13th, there's so, and reading, Homecoming, American Marriage. And I feel bad that I hadn't read these before, but I feel more empowered really to, as I read and continue to find out more about this topic so we can move on. Oh, and, but Karen, yes, you have exactly 1 minute to mention Virtual Mitzvah Day. Yay!
Okay, I'll be really quick.
Yes.
Hey everyone, Tani, thank you so much. So in August, on August 16th, we're having a congregation-wide, and anybody else is welcome to join us too, a virtual Mitzvah Day of Action. This is for us to have impact and through connection. And the idea is also that this starts our journey of preparing for the high holidays in our spirits, in our souls, and in our actions. So it will be a virtual day on August 16th. You should be, please save the date. There will be activities throughout the day. You don't have to spend the whole day. You can plug in whenever you want. We'll be recording things, so if you can't join that day, you can do them other days. But racial injustice will definitely be part of the focus. And frankly, everything we do has a racial lens also. So whether it's an economic or, you know, environmental piece, that has a racial part too. But, you know, please save the date for August 16th and you'll see a flyer soon for that.
All right, Julie, go ahead.
Sure. So regarding the National Civic Engagement Campaign from the Reform Movement, and also RAC Illinois is very involved in many different things here in the state of Illinois, and also combating voter suppression in states where that's a bigger issue, including Wisconsin. I guess I would just say a couple things. If you're not already in touch with Diane Zinman and Diane, you're the chair of this, right? You're the person who's leading on this.
Yes, also Jack Kaplan. Well, Wendy Rhodes is the co-chair of Tikkun Olam, but for RAC Illinois, I'm
Right.
one of the leaders, Sharon Stein, Jack Kaplan, Rich Amon. So you can reach out to any one of us for more information.
Right, so they can give you the information, and I'm just also will say that we're having our campaign call, our July campaign call for RAC Illinois. If people are interested in that, if you reach out to any of these people, they can send you the link to register, or you can feel free to reach out to me too. But yes.
Diane, go ahead.
I do have one more thing to add. One of the things that we're really looking for are young people to be involved in this. So if anyone has the name of a young person who is coming of voting age or is already voting age that can assist, there is training for these people through RAC Illinois, and it's a wonderful training. So get those kids out. We need them to vote this year more than ever before.
I think the youth training is July, I want to say 28th.
I think the 28th. Yeah, the 28th,
okay.
I think. Yeah.
Well, I cannot believe that the hour has gone. I feel like I just sat down. We can't, Tani, we just can't thank you enough. And maybe as our year progresses, we'll get back to you and tell you all the things we've done. And let's see, trying to think, And I think that's it. You know, if you need anything, you can contact Diane, Wendy, me, Holly. So just let us know, and we look forward to seeing everybody. And, you know, that's it. That's all. That's all I have to say this morning.
Tani, you're the best. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Tani.
Thank you all for your
Vanessa.
Thank you,
time.
everybody. This was a great program.
Thank you all for being here.
Have a wonderful day.
Take care, everybody. Be
Care.
safe.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.